Oh, there we
Yes.
go. Okay. All right. So we're going to start on the book of Ruth today. And at the beginning of Ruth, it tells us that this is going on in the time of Judges. And I want to set forth there, and David, feel free to chime in if I'm wrong. But these judges that we're told about are not the same thing as what we picture as judges today, or somebody in robes who sits in a court and decides things. The judges that are being spoken of were people who led God's people into battle and won against superior numbers because God was on their side. And so the judges were chosen to be sort of the leaders. And in the history, in the Old Testament history, we have different sets of people who gain authority. We have in the time of Genesis, we have the patriarchs. And then in the time of Exodus, we have Moses, basically, is the person of authority. And then we have this period where the judges were the people who were in authority. And then the judges were replaced by kings who were in authority. And then when the kings became corrupt and lost authority, the prophets were in authority. So you have, you know, as the Old Testament story goes on, you see the authority shifting to different groups of people. If you would get out the scripture I sent from Judges 2, I believe, it just kind of sets up the story of what's happening during this portion of the history. Judges 2, verses 6 through 19. And I just want to set up that you may remember that after Moses died, Joshua, who was Moses' second in command, took over and led the people into the promised land. So here's sort of what happens then. After Joshua had dismissed the Israelites, they went to take possession of the land, each to their own inheritance. The people served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him and who had seen all great things the Lord had done for Israel. Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110, and they buried him in the land of his inheritance, Timnath Heres, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gash. After the whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. And the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. They forsook the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshiped various gods of the people around them. They aroused the Lord's anger because they forsook him and served Baal in the Ashtoreths. In his anger against Israel, the Lord gave them into the hands of raiders who plundered them. He sold them into the hands of their enemies all around, whom they were no longer able to resist. Whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them. Just as he had sworn to them, they were in great distress. Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. Yet they would not listen to their judges, but prostituted themselves to other gods and worshiped them. They quickly turned from the ways of their ancestors who had been obedient to the Lord's commands. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, he was with the judge and saved them out of the hands of their enemies, as long as the judge lived. For the Lord relented because of their groaning under those who oppressed and afflicted them. But when the judge died, the people returned to the ways even more corrupt than those of their ancestors, following other gods and serving and worshiping them. They refused to give up their evil practices and stubborn ways. So here we have kind of a microcosm of a history that plays out kind of over and over again. The same thing that happened when Moses was leading the people out of the promised land, and they had a little good luck, and so they started worshiping other gods and fell away, and they got punished, and so Moses was returned to authority. This is an interesting thing, that they were promised that they would be delivered into the land of milk and honey. And this, what I just read, is the explanation of what messed that up. In other words, they got there, and as long as Joshua and the people who had been with him were alive, they were fine. And then when those people died out, their children, the next generation, it was sort of like the people of my parents' generation, were called the Great Generation, who'd been through the Depression and the war. And then we grew up in this world, and we were told by them, well, you've had everything given to you. We had to suffer. We didn't know the things that they had known because of what they'd been through, and so we were kind of spoiled and soft and sought pleasure and whatnot. And so that's the same kind of thing is happening there. And so they lost God's favor, and they lost the thrills of being in the land of milk and honey. And they were plunged into kind of a continual warfare that went on, I think, for several hundreds of years. And this is the period that we're in the book of Ruth, the time of the judges, a very uncertain and difficult period. And in the Old Testament, the books Joshua, Judges, and Ruth are all considered together, at least in the Christian version of the Old Testament. I think in the Hebrew Bible, they're in a slightly different order. But in the Christian Old Testament, we group Joshua, Judges, and Ruth together because it's in this very difficult time. The next book after Ruth is First Samuel, and First and Second Samuel give us the story of David, and that begins a new period. That begins the period of kings in the history of the Jewish people. So we're in this really dark phase of the history. And if you've ever read the books of Joshua and Judges, these are difficult books to read because they detail just horrible violence. And especially, I think it's in Judges, horrible acts of violence toward women that are all through this. So it's very difficult times. So go ahead, Dave.
I just want to make one comment. It seemed to me as you were reading this, part of what happens is the people are a people under Moses. And then in verse 6, as you were reading, it says they all went to their own inheritances to take possession of the land. So they divided up into tribes, basically. So there was no unified leader. I'm sure they each had their tribal leaders. So then when the judges come, they become that unifying leader for a time. And then, as you said, they go through the cycle. And it's not really until they get to David that they get unified again. So I think that's part of it. It's very tribal and not.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, there's no unity. It's a very good point. All of this, feels very contemporary to us today, and will feel even more so as we get into the book of Ruth. So I'm sort of reading this book that I recommend called Finding God in the Margins, which is a sort of a feminist way of looking at the book of Ruth that I think raises a number of points that mean something to me. The idea of the book of Ruth is that it shows us what it means to live in a fallen world as a child of God, or as the image bearer of God. And we start the story really centering on Naomi and her suffering. And there's a lot in what goes on with Naomi that mirrors Job and the book of Job and Job's experience, because it seems that when a believer is suffering, in a sense, God's character is on the line. And there's this, since and we all sort of have feelings like this when we have good things happen to us, we consider it a blessing from God. And so, in the same way, when we have bad things happen to us, we consider it a curse from God, or that God has somehow turned against us. And this is both the fallacy of Naomi and of Job, that in difficult times, a relationship with our Creator is our lifeline, and that we live in a fallen world. And that's the purpose of the Adam and Eve story. Creation was beautiful. There's a sense of the fall, and men and women from the beginning are given their freedom by God. That's necessary for them to play the role they are to play, that they be free, to decide. And freedom comes at a certain cost, because people will make the wrong decision. And that leads to sort of a cascading series of events that make life difficult for others. So that's why when somebody says, God never puts more on your plate than you can handle, the problem with that saying is that everything on your plate wasn't put there by God. Some of the things on our plate were put there by other people who didn't mean well. Some of the things on our plate were put there by our own unfortunate decisions that didn't work out too well. So God, to give God responsibility for everything on your plate is not quite the picture. The story of Ruth takes place within a full-fledged patriarchal culture, and this patriarchy is a very important aspect to this book. And I want to point out that, and this is where I disagree with a lot of evangelicals who say because there's a patriarchy represented in the Bible, that patriarchy is God's will. And I would take very serious issue with that. Patriarchy is a social system that privileges men over women, where actions of men command the focus, and women, with few exceptions, recede into the background. Under patriarchy, a woman derives her value from men, her father, her husband, and especially her sons. Sons are patriarchy's gold standard for determining the value of a woman. That standard of measurement has a devastating impact on both Naomi and Ruth. But we will not recognize the magnitude of that impact if we view their story through an American or contemporary lens and ignore the patriarchal backdrop that intensifies the severity of the crisis they face and the terrible odds stacked against them. In our American culture, we do still have a patriarchy, but it has been tempered, and it has been tempered by the activity of feminists, the activity of suffragettes, the activity of women whose lives prove that the patriarchy is BS, in a sense, that it's not a true picture. And I would say in American culture and in European culture, you have a tempered patriarchy. Whereas in other cultures in today's world, the patriarchy is strong and uncompromised and makes life very difficult for women, as we're seeing in the situation with the Taliban and other cultures. So Israel and Moab are the two cultures in which the book of Ruth takes place. Both are fallen cultures, and both are intensely patriarchal. Every narrative in the Bible takes place within this fallen context, and this means, whether in their world or in ours, we must be careful to distinguish fallen ways that human beings organize and relate to one another from the world as God created it in the beginning, and that Jesus came to restore. Jesus didn't come to give us a kinder, gentler patriarchy or a new and improved version of any other social system known to humankind. In his own words, he came to bring a kingdom that is not of this world, as it says in John 18:36. The kingdom that we lost in the fall, a kingdom that is utterly foreign to us. In opposition to this value system of the fallen world, Yahweh is raising up both women, Naomi and Ruth, for significant kingdom purposes. And by kingdom purposes, I mean not only that they will lead to the birth of David, but that we have a role in completing creation, that God's acts in converting this world into a heavenly world are through us, that we play a part in this. And in playing a part in this, we do come up against the values of the fallen world, of our culture, and that's the difficulty that we face. So by being a believer, in other words, it's wrong to assume that if you're a believer that you will not have difficulties or that you will not run into obstacles. You definitely will. And that's in this story is the story of Naomi and Ruth coming up against these obstacles. All three of the lead characters in this story, Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz, undergo significant character development from the start of the story to the conclusion. God uses their interaction with each other to transform them and, in a sense, their world. Together, the three of them create a breathtaking display of the power of Jesus' gospel to transform human lives and relationships centuries before his birth. We have so many parallels in this to the life of Christ that Jesus actually, in a sense, becomes almost a character in this story. Now, where this is a modern story is that at least since 9/11, we live in a world in which we're constantly in danger of being paralyzed by fear. And this is where we find Naomi in the beginning of the story. And it is Ruth's refusal to respond to fear that the transformation of lives begins. Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz live in a tumultuous time. The global stage at this time is dominated by political instability, they penetrated national borders. There's in the story gender inequality, racial disparity, international tensions, economic crises, injustice, violence, wars, and natural disasters. All of these things we're up against right now. In the days when judges ruled is hardly a propitious beginning. Even without cable news or internet access, all three of these characters were doubtless regularly bombarded with alarming news. But in these first 8 sentences in the book of Ruth, there is vital information that we must carry with us through the entire story. The danger in this story, because it really does have kind of a nice fairy tale sort of an ending, is that we tell it as a Disney fairy tale. Where virtue triumphs and all this kind of thing. That's not the kind of story it is. And I really want us, in examining it and in making theater out of it, to plumb the depths, in a sense, to view it as a story that does have dark elements in it. All too often, the way Naomi's story is told us doesn't stir a twinge of sympathy for her. We're given this list of things that she went through, but because we live in a slightly different world, we trivialize her suffering and, in a sense, criticize her for complaining. In doing so, we sidestep the heart of what this book is all about. So it behooves us to pause here in the beginning to look more closely at Naomi and her losses, and more importantly, to view the calamities that she suffers through the lens of patriarchy. Two facts about Naomi intensify her losses. First, that she is an Israelite, a daughter of Yahweh, a descendant of Abraham, and an heir to Yahweh's promises of blessing. Naomi's losses provoke such a powerful sense of outrage and injustice in her is the expectation that the payoff for faithfully following God will be being spared the heartaches of life. So this story is off to a bad start when we read there was a famine in the land. Let's remember, this is the land of milk and honey. There is a famine. The anonymous land is the land of Palestine that God promised to Abraham and his descendants, a land flowing with milk and honey that is instead ravaged by famine. No explanation is given as to what caused the famine. We might, from a biblical standpoint, assume this is a judgment based on the way that the people behaved after Joshua's generation. What is clear is that this is the first litany of adversities that completely alter Naomi's life and that ultimately will lead her into a crisis of faith. The famine in the land was so severe that Elimelech, Naomi's husband, packed up his family and left Bethlehem. They migrated to Moab, where there was food. Again, we have a modern story because of the way we reject refugees today. The refugees who try to get into the United States are running from just this kind of situation. I can't feed my baby. I can't feed my family. I must go someplace where I can by any means, that's necessary. Difficult as it must be to be compelled to flee your homeland because of famine, war, or terrorism, what awaits in refugee camps is often simply exchanging one form of misery for another. The second fact that intensifies Naomi's losses is that she is a female in a patriarchal world. Naomi derives value from the men in her family. Her primary responsibility as a wife was to produce sons for her husband. And here I have to pause and talk about the problem that the Jewish people have throughout history and even today is a problem of numbers. They don't have enough people. They aren't big enough to face oppression from other cultures and other governments and other societies. If you look at the history of the Jewish people, there's so many times, such as the Spanish Inquisition, where millions of Jews were just wiped out. And then, of course, in the 20th century, we have the Nazis who wiped out 6 million, I forget how many. And so, especially in Europe, there is this sense that the Jewish people are continually losing numbers. When you think about that, and you see that it is the job of women, wives in this culture to produce as many kids as possible, to to spend those years between, I don't know when it begins for a woman, 12 or 13 in this world, to the age of late 30s or whenever it is that childbearing is over. Those years must be spent having and raising children. That is a duty in order, to keep the tradition alive, to keep the people filled with workers and with other women who can give birth and increase the numbers. And in my opinion, that's a reason for a lot of the things in scripture that are difficult for us today. The idea, say, of homosexuality. This would be seen as a real sin because it takes one away from, normal marriage and childbearing. And the idea of feminism is difficult in this world. So the famine in the land was so severe that Elimelech Naomi's husband, packed up his family and he left. It could not have been easy for Naomi to see her sons intermarried with Moabite girls. No Israelite mother envisions her son marrying foreign women. And an Israelite history provided Naomi with plenty of reasons to fear their pagan influence. The fact that we are told during the 10 years that we experienced life in Moab, not a single pregnancy is mentioned within those 10 years, suggests a whole new layer of suffering that afflicted this family. Given a woman's normal monthly menstrual cycle, Naomi endured with her daughters-in-law, Ruth and Orpah, as many as 240 increasingly agonizing disappointments. After 10 years without a single pregnancy between them, both Ruth and Orpah bore the stigma of barrenness. And then the unspeakable happened. Both Mahlon and Chilion, the sons of Naomi and the husbands of Ruth and Orpah, died. We're not told why they died, but they died. The deaths of her sons represent a complete destruction of her life's work. Within the context of the ancient patriarchal culture, the day they buried Mahlon and Chilion, they essentially buried Naomi too. Unlike Job, there is no prospect of starting over for this post-menopausal widow. The deaths of all the men in the family instantly put Naomi and her daughters-in-law at risk. Their future is frightening, promising only poverty, vulnerability, and misery. The book of Ruth also raises the subject of the value of a woman, a question that patriarchy answers without blinking. What is Naomi worth? Well, count her sons. So this is why we see all through scripture, excuse me, I've got to pick up my dog here. She's barking. This is my dog.
Oh, I love him. Looks like
her.
She looks like Stuart.
So there's this continual reminder in scripture that we must take care of widows and orphans. And some people might look at that as, well, that's the good of a patriarchy. See, we take responsibility for the widows and orphans. Not true. They don't. That's why this is continually mentioned by people who represent God, prophets and others, that you must take care of the widows and orphans. In doing so, you're in a sense acting against the patriarchal customs of the society. You are giving widows and orphans a worth that is not recognized in those societies. So Naomi has no choice but to buy into the culture's view of her. Anyone in Naomi's world, including Naomi herself, would tell us with absolute certainty the story is over. Who cares about two women who are zeros? Once the men are wiped from this story, there is no story. So what we have in the book of Ruth is we have something kind of revolutionary. The biblical camera zooms in on two childless women, two zeros, and the real story begins. The plight of women is front and center, and so is the Bible's radically different view of women and their value in God's eyes. So, Heidi, you can stop recording now.